Pnawn da a croeso, welcome and good afternoon. This is the first Nesta Talks 2 of the new term. These are events that we put on at Nesta and which are designed to be a conversation with today's most interesting thinkers, focused on the big topics that decide our future. We're really pleased today to be welcoming Sharath Jeevan to discuss transforming the education system using motivational thinking to change how we nurture young minds. It's really timely, we think, to be exploring motivation at the start of a new term and at a time of real societal transition for many, especially for those of us in the UK. This theme is particularly interesting for Nesta's A Fairer Start mission, which aims to narrow the outcome gap between children growing up in disadvantage and the national average, focusing on the early years and secondary school. A Fairer Start is one of 3 innovation missions that Nesta will be working on between now and 2030, addressing some of the biggest challenges that we face today. The other 2 are A Healthy Life, which focuses on obesity and loneliness, and A Sustainable Future, focusing on reducing household carbon emissions and green jobs. So before I introduce Sharath, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Helen Wales, and I'm one of the mission managers working on Nesta's A Fairer Start mission. I'm also part of the Nesta Cymru team, focusing on how we bring a fairer start to Wales and create impact here for children and families through using innovation. And as for today's guest, Sharath Jeevan, he is one of the world's leading experts on reigniting our inner drive, or intrinsic motivation. He founded and led STIR Education, which reignited the motivation of 200,000 teachers, 35,000 schools, and 7 million children in emerging countries. He's currently the executive chairman of Intrinsic Labs, which supports organisations all around the world to solve deep motivational challenges, from governments to leading UK universities and high-profile corporations. And he's also the author of this recently published book, Intrinsic, a manifesto to reignite our inner drive. So Sharath is really keen to make this as much of a conversation as possible, given the medium that we're working with. So please do post any questions, reflections, or observations in the chat, and we'll do our best to bring them into the discussion. So, Sharath, hello.
Helen, so good to see you and to see everyone today. What a pleasure.
It's really great to have you with us. Well, let's dive straight in. And to set the context for us, could you tell us about the journey that you've taken that's led you to seeing intrinsic motivation as being so fundamental?
Thanks, Helen. It's been a very twisted journey, and I talk about that in the book. I'm not a psychologist by training. I'm an economist, actually, and all of this came through working in some of the poorest parts of the world, in the slums of Delhi, in rural parts of Uganda, in far-flung parts of Indonesia. And what I found was that I was trying to set up an NGO called STIR Education, doing fantastic work. We started STIR about 10 years ago, trying to find these really promising teaching ideas, micro-innovations that we could spread around the world. But by accident, we were reigniting the motivation of teachers. And it was a really profound realization for me that I'd got the baby in the bathwater wrong. That really what the core was that we'd been doing so many things to build a better system. India, for example, built 1 million government free to access schools across the country, 1 for every kilometer of the country almost. And yet kids were not learning or engaging because we hadn't thought about this motivation issue. And the idea of a teacher or a guru in India was thousands of years old, but that had been lost with this increase in the system. So that became my mission and purpose as well, but by accident rather than by deliberate intent, I think.
Thank you. And you talk in the book about a crisis in motivation or crisis in intrinsic motivation. Just could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, and just say, Helen, just to build off what I said, what I realized in leading STIR the last 10 years was that there was all kinds of academic research out there around what really drives us, but very little practical application as well. And so that was really what drove me to think about the book. And I think where we are right now, it's obviously been such a difficult 18 months with the pandemic for most of us. I was very lucky to have some wonderful coverage by the Daily Telegraph last week with the book launch, and they asked me to speak to 4 of their readers from very different parts of the country, very different lives, but just really moved by some of their stories. One had was a writer. She was finding it very difficult to settle back into life. She just got separated. She was walking around her town, not able to sort of be at home or be in an office and so on as well. Someone who'd been very successful in their careers, in advertising and client service, but then finding very taking himself off that ladder and trying to find a way back in. I think there was a really common theme in all of these stories, and so many stories that I talked to people today around this idea of treading water. I know we've been treading water motivationally for the last 18, 20 months. Our safety and those of the people we love has been paramount. That's obviously very important. But as we all know, if we tread water too long, there's a risk of drowning. And that fear that we won't be able to swim again. And I think it's where many of us are. I think in our lives more broadly, I talk to many people in companies now who are coming back to work. The tube's a bit busier this morning in London, but there's still that anxiety of what does this all mean now? We've got our kids going back to school in England over the last included is always already feeling a bit nervous about what this means. So I think it's really important we start swimming again and finding that right motivational path. What I hope the book will do is give us some really practical ideas of how we can find that deeper motivation in our lives as we come back gradually to normal in our lives more widely.
Thanks, Sharath. So before we dive into some of those areas in a bit more detail, could you tell us what intrinsic motivation and motivation thinking mean for you?
Yeah, so one of the metaphors I was using in the book, Helen, was this idea of thinking of life like a long Indian car journey. I've been in many Indian cars over the years, and it's you can think about what fuels the car first of all. In India, many of the cars are fueled by diesel. It's not very pleasant, both for people in the car and those outside. That's a bit like extrinsic motivation or external. That's what extrinsic basically means. It means you're doing something because something else is promised at the end. Intrinsic motivation is like driving that electric car, which feels like it's gliding. It itself is rewarding, fulfilling, pleasurable. You're driving because you want to drive. And both forms get you from A to B. But it's a bit like good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. We know that the more we can live on intrinsic drivers, the more likely we're going to be happy, fulfilled, and successful in the longer term. And where I think we've gone wrong is that it's not that these extrinsic things are not important. It's just that they have a sort of ceiling effect. So take salary, for example. Of course, we all want to be paid fairly and well and be able to put bread on the table for ourselves, our families. But I was talking to a trader last week who'd got a £20 million bonus. And the first thing he said was, I need to work harder because I heard someone else down the hall in the office got 22 million. So we know these things don't deeply motivate us. We need to go to higher order drivers. And my work is all about thinking about these questions of purpose, that sense of what we do in helping and serving others, the sense of autonomy, us being at the wheel of our lives. If you take that car example, and feel like we're in control, even though many people may be in the back seat telling us how they think we should be driving, and mastery, becoming that better and better driver over time, being that best version of ourselves, and that deep journey of progress and improvement being a really strong motivator for our lives overall. So yeah, I think trying to really move beyond some of these things like pay, working conditions, things that we're taking for granted a bit, trying to think more deeply about motivation along these elements of purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And what I try to do in the book is apply that to our education challenge today, young people and parenting, but also the world of our work, our relationships, and how we engage in the world as citizens too.
Yeah, so it'd be really interesting to spend a bit of time talking about purpose in education, because that's something that you give a lot of thought to in the books. One thing that you write about is sort of motivating teachers and the absolute importance of that, but also the challenge of motivating teachers within the education system without also acting on the education system. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you found works with both motivating the teacher workforce and then making that more system-wide.
Yeah, I think, Hannah, it's a great question. One of the interesting questions I looked at in the book is the link between how the world of work is evolving and how the world of education is evolving at the same time. And they're not converging at all, they're diverging. We're going in entirely different directions. So the world of work, and this would very much apply to the world of teachers in their working lives, it's becoming a more wicked world. And by that, I mean there are fewer and fewer easy technical solutions. What really, I think much of the more routine aspects of our work is going to be automated or is being automated already. It's the human aspect that really matters more and more. And, just to give an example when it comes to teaching, I was talking to the head of a very large foundation in Brazil, the Lemon Foundation, and during the lockdown, it had been possible to have schools meeting up in Brazil. So what the government did, and it was a hugely important effort, they got the best teachers in the country to put themselves on TV, to have a sort of teacher TV for the many kids who couldn't go to school. And these were really great teachers, far better than a Brazilian kid would have in the neighborhood of favela where they lived. But it didn't work because the kids said, look, these are not my teachers. There was no relationship in there. And I think that's what we're learning about teaching and the workforce, but also about work overall. It's these human aspects of our mastery. It's the ability to build relationships, engage young minds, ignite imaginations, create that spark and that love of learning that's so important in the teaching workforce, and what deeply motivates teachers, and that purpose of them helping and serving a young generation. What has happened, I think, is that we have gone the other way in how we've set up the school system and our accountability system. And again, we all need some basic level of accountability. No, I would certainly not question that. But we've got to such a ridiculous extent now that many head teachers I talked to in the book across the UK saw their purpose as no longer serving children or the communities, but serving Ofsted or ensuring they got well on a league table. And so we've completely distracted them from their core purpose. Teaching is intrinsically a purposeful profession. It's all about helping and serving young people and communities, but we've almost created our school system in a way that distracts from that purpose. And it's no surprise that in the UK, about 40% of our teachers want to leave the profession. We're really in that motivational crisis in teaching.
I want to come on to accountability in education in a second, but I just want to stick for a moment with the role of teachers and how in your opinion we can create a teaching profession that has that space to really respond to intrinsic motivation and to build relationships, because that's a really core theme in your book. And I wonder as well if you could tell us a little bit about the role of nurturer, which is something else that you talk about.
Yeah, so what's happened, I think, because of the accountability pressures in the system, I think teachers and school leaders have become what I call in the book talent managers rather than talent nurturers. Let me just describe the difference. In education, that might mean increasingly selecting kids as the main way of achieving academic outcomes, right? The easiest way to score well on a league table is to say, look, I'm going to be very selective over what kids I bring in, and that can be directly or indirectly. And what happens with that then is the school almost sees their role as sort of, my job is just to find the kids and they will just go off and do their thing. And my game is really a selection game. The schools, I think, that are really going to make the biggest difference in our lives, and this is true in other professions all the way from entrepreneurship all the way to restaurants. I looked at this in the book. They are genuine nurturing organizations. They help take young people to places they wouldn't have got to otherwise. And the core of a good nurturer is about really keeping young people deeply engaged and loving the process of learning itself, and really seeing themselves as creating new connections, new possibilities, helping children and young people see themselves completely differently. and also really helping build those lifelong learning muscles that are going to be the core of where of what the world the young people are going to face. It's going to be that world of unknown unknowns, as the last 18 months has shown us. They're going to need to be able to navigate all kinds of wicked problems themselves. So the role modeling teachers do in showing, role modeling those behaviors day in, day out, it's so important, as that Brazilian story showed early on.
I mean, that feels like a good place to sort of start broaching that question of accountability, because I think one of the challenges that people working in education often find, and which you've already articulated, is that the measures are often not aligned to the vision either of the individuals and sometimes of the system. And in your book, you talk about exams as if they are sort of hygiene factors, and academic success as if it's a hygiene factor rather than, you know, the core purpose of education. And it strikes me that that's something sort of quite noble, and that a lot of people would agree with in principle. But then we come up against this challenge that the way we measure education in the UK still is through some very conventional systems. So I'm interested in how we sort of square that circle, really, and if there are any different ways of measuring, I know, engagement, for example, that you've seen in your work that we might be able to learn from.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So, yeah, I think with measurement, we've become, you know, like Mark Twain saying, we've become like drunks attached to the lamppost. We're using measurement really for support, not illumination. And the challenge has been we've taken what's easy to measure, not what's right to measure. And the core of that is that these academic outcomes we're measuring are largely about content and knowledge. Those are, we do need a core of content knowledge for sure to succeed in the world as young people, so no question about that. But that's not really the core. The core is the ability to apply that knowledge in ways that are relevant for you and purposeful for you. That's not being measured very strongly at all. So I think we need a whole set of new measures in education that try to capture that, but also just the trust, I think, in common sense that if we create, I was very struck by Ellie's comment in the chat about, you know, these respectful spaces where young people and teachers interact and transact. If we can create that, we know that that will create engagement. And there's increasing evidence, I share some of it in the book, that engagement is in a way, the secret sauce in education. If we get kids to deeply engage in their educational process, we know that all kinds of good things come out of that. There's a sense of flow. They feel almost as if time has stood still. They feel deeply immersed in the educational experience. But also, I think equally importantly, they develop the transferable skills that will help them do whatever they want to do in the future really well. So that's around applying the learning, about being creative, about being curious, thinking critically, communicating well. If they go deep and deeply engage in a topic, that's going to be the core. And I think our politicians have obsessed so much about what we teach, the curriculum, and all this constant meddling and interference. There's been almost no attention to how we teach. And I think it's the how we teach this content that is so important. You can teach the same thing, but if it does really bring that deep sense of engagement and motivation, we know in the longer term that's so much better for young people.
I think it's really interesting what you say about sort of learner engagement, going more deeply into a topic, having that freedom. Because I think one of the things that those working in education have seen is that in some cases, lockdown created those opportunities. It didn't work as well for everybody, but for some children, that sort of being off timetable, being able to work at your own pace, being able to choose what you do. And I know there are stories of a lot of teachers who use pupil choice and sort of learn a voice really effectively during lockdown. To me, they speak to the idea of autonomy in your book as well. But it strikes me that that's like a real leap of faith, isn't it, for teachers, like giving learners that kind of autonomy. What support structures, what can be put in place to sort of help that happen and help it happen well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a really interesting parallel, because obviously the same dilemma teachers have, can I trust my kids, basically? Or it's the same what politicians have of teachers. Can I trust my teachers to actually know that, you know, they're best placed to solve these problems? And I think in both areas, the answer is yes, but with a little caveat, which is that what we're learning about autonomy, remember, autonomy is being at the wheel of our lives, and in this case, our professional lives. It's not chaos. So I think I talk about in the book, with STIR Education, we started running teacher network meetings where we'd give teachers new ideas, new practices they could try, though evidence-based. Initially, we made it a complete free-for-all where teachers could choose whatever was on top of their minds right at that moment. That was good. They were working on really relevant things, but often they took things that had long payback periods. They might work on community engagement, which takes several years to see fruits. What that didn't do is create those quick wins and quick feedback loops that meant teachers would see progress, that would motivate them to put more effort in, and you'd go on a positive spiral. So what we started to do is give still teachers a lot of autonomy of what they did in each meeting, but a little bit of scaffolding on, in the first few months, why not think on these areas broadly, but you decide how to apply them, what that means to you, because we know that would give that quick feedback that could be motivating. So there's an in-between. I don't mean if you're a teacher, you have to worry about this is going to be anarchy. There's a nice kind of guided autonomy middle ground here that you can play to. And I think our politicians could do the same with our teaching force.
Yeah, I think that's something really interesting in the idea of quick wins. And you sort of talk in the book about changing routines as being a sort of signal to everybody that things are different now and things can be different, which I found really interesting. It's almost like a bit of a trick into accepting change and believing in change. And I think the idea of quick wins and putting things into practice quite quickly is something that's really live in lots of different areas of life. I mean, it's something that we think of in terms of innovation, like what can we do quite quickly to get something going, to see what happens. And that's partly about testing, but it's also partly about generating energy. I think it's interesting that you're seeing that same thing happening in the education system, that they're not worlds apart.
Yeah, I think I want to talk about this quick win idea, because I think there's a lot to unpack there. The danger I think we've gone down as a school system and as a country really is that we've gone for these quick outcomes. And I think quick wins and quick outcomes are different. I think what motivation thinking would try and say is, look, let's focus on the process. So, as you said, Helen, engagement in the classroom, if that happens well, we know over time our academic outcomes and broader socio-emotional outcomes will do really well. What we've tried to do is we've tried to very quickly climb the PISA rankings. That hasn't worked very well. We're still middling in that stuff as well. But in the process, we've tried to almost, it's that kind of phenomenon of gaming, right? You can quickly try and achieve an outcome, but the more directly you try and do it, the worse in the long term it can be. So really the idea is that if you believe in engagement and use that lever well and know the lessons are being run well, kids are deeply engaged and motivated to learn, that will lead to better academic outcomes over time. You've just got to trust that to take some time and keep following that up and keep nurturing that relationship. I think that's been very different from the quick fire, let's focus on these, foundational skills. And again, literacy and numeracy is really important. I'm not trying to say no, but what we're learning about education is it's the intermediate skills of taking that information, a child translating it, making it their own, knowing how to apply it. That's much more important over the longer term. That learning to learn muscle is going to be really critical for where the world of work is going, which is much more about these human things. We're going ever more Victorian in the way we think about our education system. The world is becoming more and more wicked, as we've seen, in the way that the world and our jobs are evolving.
Well, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that there, Sharath, in terms of the education system becoming more Victorian, because I'd like to just chat a little bit about the reforms that are happening in Wales and to get your take on them, because I think they're both really exciting and have a lot of potential, but also really resonant with the ideas that you're putting forward. And for those of you who are less aware, we have a major process of education reform and curriculum reform, and that's based around a purpose-driven curriculum. So everything within the system meeting 4 purposes: ambitious and capable learners, enterprising, creative contributors, ethical, informed citizens, healthy and confident individuals. And all of this is designed around that idea of we don't know what the world that we're preparing our children for is actually going to be. So what are the skills that we need for that unknown world? And the way this has been done has been very much co-production with the teaching profession, getting lots of people on board, lots of trust, and there is real momentum and excitement. But I think that some of the potential challenges are around wider acceptance of this. And I think one thing in particular around that question of assessment again, I think one of the problems that we have is we need to reform the examination system to fit that new curriculum. But there's resistance to that, and GCSEs are a very, very trusted brand. And that's not just about education, that's also about the wider world. It's about parents, it's about businesses. So how do we take all of those who are impacted on this journey? Because I think that's what real change really needs.
Yeah, no, a really profound point, and I've been so encouraged to hear about the work in Wales. I think it's a fantastic start. Let me give a couple of thoughts on perhaps how that could be strengthened, maybe even further. But it's a really promising initiative. There was I'm going to use a little bit of a bleak example here, but in the 1930s, Britain was in the gold standard economically. So the British pound was pegged to gold, the price of gold, basically. And it was a very similar argument to this GCSE stuff, right? That there's rigor in the system, it's objective, all of this stuff. There was a lot of speculation, financially, I won't go into the economic details, but Britain had to leave the gold standard. It was forced out, basically. And the economy flourished, right? Actually, we could unleash a lot of creativity in an economic system, all of these things. And I think there's a similar piece with this sense of rigor. That's always been the argument our politicians have used, that this is rigorous, this is objective. We've just seen from the debacle of the last 2 years with the marking story, it's not that rigorous, it's not that objective. There's a huge amount of judgment how we mark and assess anything in life. And any assessment, no matter how well it's done, can only capture a tiny sliver of what a young person's potential and she really is. So let's take that kind of outdated nonsense and throw it out of the room. Let's really build what we need to build now as a country and as a society. And I think you're absolutely right about the next challenge with this being, I think Wales has done a fantastic job of having that conversation between its leaders and its teaching force. That's rare to see in many countries. That's a huge kudos there. What maybe one layer to go deeper is to say, can that conversation include two other very, very important groups? One is the world of employers, because they're ultimately the customers, if you like, of the education system, in at least in an economic sense. The second thing would be parents, or second group would be parents, because they're so important in building support for these kinds of reforms. Let me just talk about one each in turn. I think we hear time and time again, the CBI, the Competitive Federation of British Industry, keep saying our school system is not fit for purpose anymore. It's not like they're huge fans of this. Why can't we listen to that and deeply engage them and see what do they want to see? And everything I've talked to employers about is these lifelong learning muscles and foundations and love of learning. The second thing on parents is I think I'm a parent myself, we're deeply confused. I talk a lot about parenting in the book as well. I think we've sort of, it's easy to pick an Ofsted rating or a league table number as a kind of proxy for quality. It's not, it's a very crude proxy. I think the idea that our kids, that the more they can master this zigzag of life, I think is the key idea in the book. If that can be our parenting mindset, we're much more likely to get kids who are more successful, but also have lower anxiety, don't feel, Britain has one of the most anxious adolescent group in the world now in terms of our levels of anxiety, depression, suicide often. It's really scary stuff from a mental health perspective. And I think we can do so much better if we get our parents on board in that conversation as well.
Thank you. You've actually preempted one of the questions we had in advance, Sharath. That was from Gina Cullen at Henry, who asked, how do you support parents to adopt change and how do you reach the most in need? And I think that echoes some of the comments we're getting from Ellie Costello in the chat, who's talking about working with those children and those families who are sort of very much struggling with barriers to school attendance, etc. And she also talks about how there's a tendency I guess, to put the blame for bad behaviour, so-called, back onto the children, and that this becomes a barrier to engagement, rather than doing things that we've learnt in the early years, sort of looking at trauma, looking at neuroscience, sort of looking at the context in which children are operating. I wonder if you can respond to those points about some parents, for whatever reason, are not engaged in their children's education. So how can we make that happen?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of levels, and I really was very moved by reading Ellie's comments about the group she represents, and we have still a huge amount of disadvantage in our country, even though we're a very rich country. I think the first thing is to acknowledge, and I wish I'd done this earlier in my education career, honestly, that there are only some things education can fix, and some things we need a broader societal consensus on. And I think one of the things we're realizing is that when it comes to disadvantage, and I've worked for 15 years on this topic of helping disadvantaged kids in the UK and elsewhere have access to equitable education, that we need to solve these problems upstream as well. So if we don't have basic income protection, I'm a big fan of schemes like the universal basic income that can mean there's more financial security for parents of different backgrounds. We know from all of the psychological research out that if you are struggling to make ends meet, it's very hard to have the bandwidth to think about engagement in the way that you described, Helen. And just psychologically, we just don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that. So, things that Marcus Rashford has proposed, or these kinds of ideas, I think they're really important to make sure that our most marginalized have those fair starts. Ernest has done a ton on early years and early childhood development early on. We know how James Heckman and others have shown how powerful those investments are. So first of all, let's just really get that consensus right. But I think what I hope this message about motivation does is also provide a lot of encouragement for younger, for parents as well. They don't need to be academics necessarily, or to know the school curriculum that well. They may not have, had the most fulfilling educational experience themselves, in their own lives. But if they engage with their children, even asking basic questions, have you done your homework? Asking them about what they've learned in school, engaging and just checking if the child is engaged themselves. There's increasing evidence and research that's becoming more and more important in achieving really good support at home and being open to have the conversation with teachers. Often it feels like we're sort of almost in competition now for children's attention between teachers and parents. Can we have that dialogue? And I think teachers could also open up doors with points more actively so that dialogue can happen. There's a lot of, I think, fruitful ground there to make.
Thanks. I think you started to respond there to some of the questions in the chat about advice for parents in the early stages of education, from Andre. I wanted to ask you as well about the connection for you between motivation and aspiration. I ask this because those of us who work in education are often met with the idea that, there's a lack of aspiration. And sometimes you might argue that's the case, but it often strikes me that what that's actually saying is people don't want the same things we think they should want, or people want different things to what we think is best. And I'm wondering if there's a role for thinking in terms of motivation instead of aspiration, perhaps. What's your view?
Yeah, I love that idea, Helen. I'd love to explore it with you a little bit. So I really think that's true, because what we're finding with aspiration is that, often if you're coming from a challenging reality now, it's hard to almost set your sights high enough. I would really agree with that. I've worked with many young people in disadvantaged areas. It just doesn't happen because I'm working now in East London, for example. Many of the Bangladeshi communities here, or communities generally, they may never have been into the city of London at all, even though we're about 500, maybe a kilometer, less than a mile away from that right now. So there is that challenge for sure, and that's no one's fault. Just that's how our lives are increasingly constructed in ways that we're more narrowly defined in our communities, and we don't venture out in the way we used to as much. The second challenge of this is not just a disadvantaged young person problem. There's a well-worn Arab saying that I mentioned in the book, which says that the son of a duck is a floater. The son of a duck is a floater, which means that young people expect their parents to do everything for them. And that's becoming a problem in our more affluent communities and neighborhoods as well. So the challenge with aspiration again is that once you have a certain level of income for young people who are in a advantage or middle class or above family, that aspiration is harder to achieve as well because they've got some of those creature comforts. So I think that idea of motivation being a more powerful way of thinking is really interesting. And what I found about people who are most motivated in their, let's take careers as an example, they don't follow their passion. That's, I think, can be very idealistic. They follow their problem. So let me repeat that. They follow their problem. They don't follow their passion. By that, I mean they fall in love with the problem. And it's totally a wicked problem, a problem where there's no easy technical solution. So I'd contrast racial injustice or inequality as wicked problems, for example. If you do that, what happens is you become obsessed by that problem, even though how you contribute to it might change over time. But that becomes a North Star, that becomes their personal mission statement, if you like, as well, their purpose line. And they're happy then to do, it might be a very mundane first job, but they know that they're, let's say they're working for an MP, I don't know, doing a lot of photocopying, for example, or just looking at lots of random constituent files. They know that still contributes to that wider problem they're trying to work on. So I think the more we can make that central to young people's life and help them find a problem they deeply want to fall in love with, the more likely that they're going to enjoy education and the world beyond.
Yeah, I don't know many who would disagree with that. But I suppose my challenge back to that, Sharath, is it possible for every job to offer that opportunity? And I suppose that links into another provocation, which is this idea of intrinsic motivation a bit of a luxury when for plenty of people hygiene factors simply aren't in place. I'm just wondering what you think about that. Like, are we in danger? We've seen with COVID that professional jobs, jobs where there's jobs like you and I have, let's be honest, where we can work from home, where there's a lot more flexibility and opportunity to craft work around your life. That's not accessible to everybody. So how do we stop this feeding inequality, essentially?
I think it's a real concern. I've seen evidence recently that our working worlds are diversing even further. So if you are white collar, you can drop the kids at school. You can have that flexibility. If you are in a so-called blue collar job, you don't have that. I really think that's a real issue today. I think because those hygiene factors are less present in these other jobs, it's even more important to get the intrinsic factors right. And in my chapter in work in the book, I looked at all kinds of professions from firefighters to bartenders, and I concluded that actually all of these jobs can be made motivating. It's a little bit, it takes a bit more imagination. They're not as glamorous as perhaps other jobs, but it's definitely there. And let me just give you one example if I can. I was writing the book at a bar actually for part of the writing, and I watched a bartender spending about 45 minutes with a couple at the bar, getting taste and smell different spirits and concoctions and so on. And I went up afterwards and said, "What were you doing there? Why were you spending so much time?" He said, "Look, that was a middle-aged man and his daughter. He was divorced, the father. My job at that point was not to serve drinks. It was to form and forge human connections. And so I wanted to make sure that dad looked cool in front of his daughter so that there would be the beginnings of a relationship, and then she would want to see him in the visitation periods he was allowed and so on as well." So every job has these broader elements of mastery that I talk about in the book. And all of those jobs can be made more motivating and purposeful. It just takes more imagination. And one of the ideas in the book is to have more job crafting where employers and employees can talk about this honestly, have these open conversations, and make these jobs more motivating. It doesn't take money. It just takes a little bit of commitment and a bit of listening and co-creation, to use your words.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if changes in the job market at the moment might inspire that. I mean, there are obviously lots of factors around things like the crisis in hospitality and HGV driving at the moment, but I think they are potentially forcing employers. Let's hope there's a chance that they're forcing employers to think differently about the work they offer. I guess the challenge is it tends to only come at crisis point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we've got this phenomenon around the world. It started off in the US, but I think we're seeing it now in the UK, this movement around the Great Resignation. Some of you might have heard of this term. So mass resignation is happening in so many fields now. And how many of us haven't been in a cafe or restaurant and found that people are short of staff right now as well? This is sometimes, I think it does require a bit of a crisis to force us to acknowledge the problem. And I talk in the book about this idea of articulating the cost of inaction as a first way of getting on the right motivational journey. Sometimes we accept things for far too long. We just assume that's the way we have to do things. School systems have to be this way. Work has to be this way. And it's nonsense because it's often lazy and outdated thinking, honestly, if we're honest with ourselves. This is a chance. We've come out of the pandemic. We're not coming out. So many of those assumptions that we thought were true have proved to be false. Why don't we have the courage now to really step forward and acknowledge that and find a better way? And I really hope that the book will be a helpful guide in that journey in all aspects of our lives.
And there are some great questions in the chat, which are sort of really taking that back to education. So Stephen Robinson has asked, would it be better to spend more time in schools teaching children to define problems and use computers to help solve them? And then there's also a question earlier on from Katie Duncombe about the role of arts and creativity in the curriculum.
Yeah, I think that they're wonderfully linked. Thanks, Helen, for bringing them together. Because what's happening with our school systems is as we want to drive towards more and more measurable results, the kind of content where we're exposing our young people to, we are basically dumbing it down. Let's be brutally honest here. We're doing that because it's easy to measure these things. The challenge is those things that are simpler, where there's a nice multiple choice answer that we can put on our SAT score or whatever else our accountability system wants us to do. That's exactly the kind of stuff that is no longer as valued and will be increasingly devalued in the working world. Modern work will be much more about is these wicked human problems that are much fuzzier, much harder to even understand. And I really agree with Stephen about even defining them is going to be a problem. And there's a wonderful quote from Adam Grant I use in the book, which is that success in work today is no longer about finding the right problems to solutions. Right solutions to problems. It's about finding the right problem to solve. It's about finding the right problem to solve. So more and more, we need to be exposing our young people to very open, fuzzy things that they need to start to structure and define for themselves. And I think arts, I fully agree, that's a wonderful way of doing that. I do a lot of work advising different organizations on these aspects. One of my clients is TBA 21 Academy, and they use art to unlock questions around climate change for young people. So they don't give them a nice scaffold. That kids have got to use art as a vehicle to express and explore these issues. We need to find many more inspiring examples to look at these wicked problems differently for our young people.
I sort of like the idea of a sort of celebration of complexity and a sort of head-on approach to things that are more complex, and embedding that. We've had a couple of questions as well about teacher training, and I guess sort of teacher support more widely. Alice Turner has asked, how can we better support teachers to engage in their intrinsic motivation and therefore better support the children they teach? And then we had a question from Claire Farrell before the event about how do we persuade government to make those changes?
Yeah, one of the really great questions, Helen, and thanks, Alice, as well, both of you, for the questions. So I think one of the big mindset problems we've had with this is we've thought about teaching as a kind profession. The narrative has been about, we can reduce teaching down to some best practices. What are those teaching practices that are going to, lift attainment everywhere, that we can codify and put in a nice flip chart or manual, and that's complete nonsense. And what we're learning about more and more about teaching, it's the ultimate wicked profession. By that, I mean that every second or minute in front of a teacher, you've got a different child, a different context, a different curriculum topic. And the teacher's got to make in real time, that's the other dynamic, millions of potential, or choose between millions of potential permutations and combinations of what they do to respond. It's a classic real-time wicked profession. We cannot reduce it to logistics. And the Gates Foundation in the US spent $250 million trying to decode teaching to a nice booklet of practices. It was absolutely a failed attempt to position, I talk about in the book. We can't do that with teaching. It's a much more complex and rich profession than we would often like to think about. That means, to build on your questions, we've got to rethink teacher training. The human aspects of teaching, teaching is ultimately about the relationship between an adult and a child. It's about role modeling. It's about inspiring and motivating. It's about nurturing, and as we talked about earlier, a teacher at their best is a talent nurturer to the new generation. And so all the technical stuff, subject knowledge, of course, they're important, but they are, I think, increasingly, to use our language, hygiene factors. The core is that deep engagement that will motivate a child to want to learn today and want to keep learning through their lives. And I think we need to really rebalance what's focused on in traditional teacher training.
Well, that's a great question that Holly's just put in the chat there, which I think picks back what we were saying earlier. It's like, how can you talk a little bit more about how we can measure this stuff that really matters? And I think there is something in Holly's question. We still have a system that needs some kind of accountability from somewhere, and maybe we need to sort of wean ourselves off certain kinds of accountability collectively, but that's going to take time.
Yeah, I think the good news, and I did some of this at Stir Education, there are increasingly good measures for engagement out there. And I talked in the book about one from a university in Australia that found a very interesting school engagement index. It wasn't perfect. I mean, none of these tools are. But I think increasingly we can directly measure whether kids are motivated and engaged in school. And it could be very simple things. Are they asking questions, for example? Are they looking for deeper discussion, whatever topic you're covering? Are they asking for you to teach something that in a way that they're driving the lesson? They are pulling you as a teacher rather than you pushing content onto them. There's some really nice behavioral metrics that are increasingly rigorous. They're not perfect, but they could easily be used in many classrooms and perfected without the help of the teaching community as well. But I think, again, let's not make perfection the enemy of the good. I think there's lots we can start with. We are a very, very qualified profession, right? I think we have one of the best generation teachers in our country that we've ever had. We need to trust ourselves as a profession more. And I think compared to medicine, that's not been great either, but there's been a narrative of us allowing politicians to tell us what to do. We are the experts of our profession. I think, institutions like College of Teaching are a good first step towards this, but we need to have the professional confidence to tell parents, employers, and our national leaders what's right in terms of our profession. Have that confidence.
Yeah, I think those points around trust and confidence, I mean, it's really complex what you're describing, isn't it? So like having the trust to sort of let go and give power back to learners, be more responsive. I think linked to that, though, I'm really interested in, I guess, the limits of individual motivation. I mean, one of the things that we know from behaviour science is that individual intention can only go so far. A great example is around food environments. Like you can make your decision that you're going to eat really healthily, but if everyone around you has habits that you're trying to resist, and if the world around you, if the shops and the access is different, that motivation isn't really going to do the job. So I'm interested in what you think about that relationship between individual motivation and context.
Yeah, it's really critical, Helen. And the book looks at three sort of lenses on our lives. One is us as individuals, and we can do a lot. I think we do have a lot of autonomy. I think if you're a teacher, you are in some ways the queen and king of your classroom. Just the accountability system has sort of weakened that idea, but you have a lot of freedom there as well that we can harness more. But it also looks at the lens of our organization. So at a school level or a company level, there's a lot we can do to create cultures around motivation, and that involves engaging leadership. And what I was suggesting in the book in a nutshell is have a conversation with your line manager. Maybe it's the head teacher, the deputy head teacher, the SLT member, if you're a teacher, whoever it might be, the middle leader. But have the conversation, put a cost on what you're feeling. Tell them, her or him, why it's hurting you so much. Motivation, explain what you could do differently. Give them ideas on how you could spend your time better. Maybe that, 4 hours a week you're spending entering data into a spreadsheet is not the best use of your time. Maybe there's a piece of software that can help you and free your time to actually plan lessons to engage kids more. Have that conversation. And more often than not, I think especially given the labor market dynamics you described, there may be an open ear. And I think we need to be more confident in that discussion. I do a lot of work with leaders as well, and I hope the book appeals to them as well, to ask them to change their mental models also. And the final bit, perhaps the most ambitious chapter in the book, is about our politicians, our leaders, and it asks the question: how can we get them to get motivated in the right way again? We've seen over these few months how important they are to our lives, whether we like it or not. And we don't do very much training. There's not much mastery development for our politicians. I talk to people in the House of Lords. If you become a new Lord, you have someone shows you to the toilet. They show you where the dispatch box is. There's not much more, honestly. And that kind of amateurish way of developing our national leaders is not going to fit the world we need. They need to be able to communicate a clear national purpose. They need to be able to explain where the country is going, in a devolved sense, of course, given the UK, but also explain how education fits into that national purpose and vision. And I haven't heard that being, done very compellingly over the last few years for a long time in this country and most countries in the world.
There's a lot we could pick up on there. This is one thing I will just say is interestingly that education reform in Wales had cross-party agreement from the outset, which means that it can go beyond parliamentary or Senedd terms. And I think we won't go into it now because there's a question in the chat I want to come to, but that sort of limitation on timeframes is something that we hear a lot. And I think particularly for people working in the charitable sector or in philanthropy who are expected to deliver outcomes very quickly, like within a year, within 3 years, which speaks back to what you were talking about time earlier on in our conversation. But we had a fantastic question from Mark Ellis, which is about what 3 quick wins do you think schools should aim for right now?
Great question. So let me try my best, Mark. It's a very important question. The first thing is to recognize things have changed. I'd say the pandemic has told us that all of the old mental models we had, I think many of us had an inkling they were not right. The pandemic has showed us that they are not right. Let's just act on that conviction as a school leadership, as individual teachers. That would be my first one. The second one would be to say, really write down how the current situation is hurting you as a school and as an individual professional in the school. What are we not doing as a result of what we are continuing to keep in our mental models? Is it about we're not engaging students well, we're not genuinely creating a clear purpose for the school, we're not nurturing the potential of all our young people, whatever it might be? Write that down, because it really helps to make it tangible and real to everyone, and it creates a momentum to action. The third step, and I talk about this in the book, is find that first step, that small thing that can start moving in the right direction. I talked to a school in East London that decided that they wanted to develop mastery in table tennis, Morpeth School in East London, not because it was linked to the curriculum directly, but they wanted their kids to feel confident in something and be motivated in something. And table tennis, that love of that sport trickled across the whole school, and it led to so many changes and then moving up in so many ways as a school. So often there's a small step you can take as a school community that can really propel you in the right direction. So it's a big problem. I know we talked about a lot of big issues. There are some very, very tangible, practical things we can do that I share in the book that we can really move in the right direction behind.
Thanks. And there are some sort of great comments coming up in the chat as well about things like computational thinking. And I guess all these ways we have now of encouraging children to just learn how to think differently. And I guess that links to what will probably be our final question, which is, Nesta is an innovation organisation. We are looking to solve with a fairer start a really tricky problem. It's not one that has been ignored. How do we close that disadvantage gap? What advice would you give us, I'm not asking you to solve it for us now, but where could we use the motivational thinking techniques that you've been describing?
I think what's the sort of the rainbow, if you like, at the cloud, Ellen, is that I think we can really rethink what's important to young people now. And if we take that mindset that what really matters is to engage them, to help them find motivation in something in their lives, ideally in the school environment, either directly academically or in the wider school experience, there's a lot we can do. This becomes a much more possible journey. What I'd love to do is have a conversation with this amazing community. Please connect with me on social media, and Nesta will be sending the links out. Please let me know your thoughts on the book. I'd love to build this idea of how we can work with all young people to find that motivation, that love of learning while they're in the school, and that deep relationship with their teachers and school communities. And I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation and journey, but I believe that every step we take will get us in the right direction.
Thank you, and I'm sure that many people will take you up on that that offer, Sharath. And I think for me, one of the threads that runs through your book and also the work that we're doing and that many of us in this field do is the need to connect different people and different parts of a system in a way that is really meaningful. You know, it's very easy to sort of pay lip service to things like collaboration. And I wonder if your principles around purpose and intrinsic motivation can perhaps give some of us a useful hook through which to do that. So we're just about out of time. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for joining us, and particularly to everybody who's commented and asked questions in the chat. It's been really interesting to see your thoughts, and I hope we've managed to address as many of them as possible. We've posted a very, very short survey in the chat, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete that for us, just to give us a bit of feedback as we continue to develop our series of Nesta Talks 2 events. Speaking of which, our next session will be on the 24th of September, and Bayo Adelaya will be joining us to talk about why diversity is critical to innovation success. I think that's going to be another really fascinating conversation. And the final thing, of course, for me to do is say a huge thank you, or diolch yn fawr, as we say here, to Sharath for joining us and for being so responsive in his comments and contributions. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone. I really hope we can build a movement around this together. Thank you.